Have you ever thought, if one day you left everything, your homeland, your honor, and your past just to follow a letter from a man you have never met, would you have the courage to bet your life on the words that promised a peaceful home? In the late 19th century, in the frontier town of Silver Creek, Wyoming, a girl named Evelyn Hartwell, frail, poor, and almost lost in love, stepped off a stagecoach into the snow. In her hands, she carried only an old suitcase and a proposal from Daniel Mercer, who described himself as a gentle farmer in need of a companion to share his simple life on the prairie. Evelyn believed she was about to start over a humble but sincere beginning. But what happens when the poor farmer is actually the owner of a half of Silver Creek, the powerful man the town whispers in fear of, when the iron gates of the Mercer estate open? Evelyn realizes she has become not only a male bride, but also a witness in a story written with secrets, guilt, and the choice between love and justice. If it were you, what would you do? Believe in the man of your dreams, or stand up and face the truth that could destroy everything? Please join me on the journey of Evelyn Hartwell, where a letter promising happiness opens the door to destiny. In the story, mail-order bride thought she was marrying a poor farmer, but he owned half the territory. If you believe that true love always begins with courage, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts channel to join me in today's story. They say the West is where men go to seek their fortunes and women go to forget the past. Perhaps that is true. For Margaret Ellison, a 25-year-old girl from Boston, left the city with nothing and a letter in her frayed coat pocket. She had no parents, no one to call home. 2 years after the plague, Margaret survived on odd jobs, laundry, mending, cleaning houses she never entered. Every winter morning, when the cold seeped into her bones, she would quietly walk out into the street, telling herself, just get through today. But those todays dragged on until the letter from Wyoming territory arrived. The letter writer was Thomas Avery, a man who described himself as a lonely farmer living near the town of Dawson's Ridge. His handwriting was neat and firm, like someone who knew exactly what he wanted. I do not promise riches, but I have a small home, a field to tend, and a heart that has never been shared. Margaret read the letter dozens of times, each time imagining the man's face. Perhaps he was gentle and quiet. Perhaps he too bore wounds that only silence could heal. And so, one snowy morning, she wrote back, and then decided to sell her mother's only hairpin to buy a train ticket west. The journey lasted nearly 2 weeks, through lands so vast that humans were dwarfed by the sky. On the cramped train, Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the long stretches of plains and mountains, her heart filled with fear and hope. She had heard that Wyoming was harsh winds that could tear barn doors apart, snows that could bury crops. But in her dream she still saw the little cabin, the blue smoke of the evening, and a man smiling as she carried dinner onto the porch. Maybe it was a vision, but it was the only vision she wanted to believe. It was near dusk when the train pulled into Dawson's Ridge. The first sights she saw were misty purple hills, the smell of freshly rained earth, and the neighing of horses from the shipping station. The town was small, but strangely bustling lumber wagons, men in wide-brimmed hats, and women hurrying with baskets of bread. Margaret stepped onto the platform, her skirts covered in dust, her heart pounding. She clutched the faded letter, her only map to her new life. Thomas Avery stood waiting near the stagecoach stop. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the tanned face of a man accustomed to working outdoors. His rough clothes were worn, and his cowboy hat was tilted slightly to cover half his forehead. When he spoke, his deep voice surprised Margaret. "Miss Ellison, I am Thomas." The voice was not what she had imagined, not dry, but full of hesitation, as if he was afraid of scaring her. Margaret nodded slightly, simply replying, "Yes, I am Margaret." They looked at each other for a moment, like two strangers trying to find their memories in the falling afternoon light. Then Thomas reached out to take the small suitcase and said softly, "It's a long way to the farm. You can rest a bit if you want." She shook her head. "I can go." And so they sat in the carriage, rolling away from town. The wind carried the scent of young pine trees and the chirping of insects. Thomas spoke little, only glancing over his shoulder at her now and then, as if he wanted to say something but then stopped. The sky darkened, and as they turned onto the dirt road that wound up the hillside, Margaret saw the small wooden house under the birch canopy. Smoke from the kitchen drifted softly through the eaves. The pale yellow light from the window shone on her face, a face that had never been called peaceful. Thomas got out first and held out his hand. "Welcome home." Margaret stepped down and touched his hand, warm and calloused. At that moment, a strange feeling arose in her, both of safety and of standing on the threshold of something she did not fully understand. Inside, everything was so simple it was touching an oak table, 2 old chairs, a faded family photograph, a hunting rifle hung on the wall, and a kettle was humming beside the fire. Thomas poured her a cup of tea and said, "I've lived here for over 10 years. The land isn't very fertile, but if you know how to use it, it can still feed people." Margaret smiled slightly. "I can't ask for anything more." But that night, lying on the hardwood bed, she heard a horse whinny outside the stable and saw a flickering light in the barn behind her. A man's silhouette moved in the light, not unlike Thomas's. For a moment, she thought she heard a voice low and urgent, and then it stopped. Little did she know that, right beneath the ground where she had just set foot, were secrets enough to change this entire land. Margaret closed her eyes, clutched the small cross in her hand, and said to herself, "Tomorrow will be different." Outside, the prairie wind rose, blowing the curtains open, carrying with it the cold iron smell of the coming storm. And that's when fate began to turn. But peace on Dawson's Ridge, like love on the frontier, never comes without a price. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the wooden windows, Margaret Ellison woke in the small attic room of the Avery homestead. The smell of smoke and the crowing of roosters drifted up from the backyard. Everything was quiet, too quiet for the night before the night when she could still hear whispers on the wind. Margaret put on her sweater and stepped out onto the porch. Before her was a vast open valley, surrounded by mist-shrouded mountains. In the distance, herds of horses moved, small black dots on the grass. The wind carried the scent of hay and fresh earth, carrying with it a feeling both strange and familiar, as if she had dreamed of this place long ago. Thomas Avery was chopping wood by the stable. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Sleep well?" Miss Ellison. Margaret nodded. "I have never felt so peaceful." "Peace is a rare gift in this part of the world," he said, placing the log on the pedestal, the axe making a dry clang against the wood. "But you'll get used to it. The land here never stays gentle for long." That statement made her a little stunned, But Thomas turned away without saying anything more. That morning, he took her down to Dawson's Ridge to pick up some supplies. It took almost an hour, the wheels crunching on gravel, the horses' pecks rhythmically like a sad song. Down in the valley, the town appeared not as small as she'd expected. There was a bank, a liquor store, a blacksmith shop, and even a 2-story hotel with a gleaming brass sign. People looked at her as the carriage stopped in front of the grocery store. Some smiled politely, but one look sent shivers down Margaret's spine, not curious, but measuring, assessing. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Callahan, greeted them with a smile mixed with caution. "Ah, so this is Mr. Avery's new bride." Thomas nodded. "Yes, Miss Ellison from Boston. It's a long way," Mrs. Callahan said, her eyes scanning Margaret. "You're not used to the climate yet." "Not yet, but I'll try." "That's right. Here, people live by their efforts." Her tone wasn't malicious, but in the way she emphasized the word others, Margaret still felt like an outsider. They stopped at a small luncheonette off the main road. In the corner, 3 men in black coats and wide-brimmed hats were chatting. When Thomas entered, they fell silent. One, a man in his 40s with a bushy beard, leaned in and said softly enough for Margaret to hear, "Our poor farmer has found a new bride." Thomas didn't answer. He just put his hand on her back and guided her to the empty table. But Margaret could feel the change in the atmosphere, like when horses stop eating because they smell smoke. "Who are they?" she asked quietly as the waiter left. "The merchants here," Thomas said, looking out the window. "They have their own ways of making money. I'm different." Different in what way? He was silent, sipping his coffee. "You'll find out." Margaret didn't dare ask more, but in his hands, she saw calluses not just from plowing, but from holding something too tightly for too long. In the afternoon, as they left the bar, she caught sight of a woman standing on the porch of the Golden Spur Hotel Noble, wearing a white fur hat, her eyes as cold as a frozen lake. She looked at Margaret for a long time, then turned to Thomas, smiling softly. "It's been a while since you've been back in town, Mr. Avery." Thomas bowed slightly, his voice reserved. "Mrs. Langford." The woman smiled softly. "I hear you're married. That's good news." Margaret only had time to nod in return, but in the moment their eyes met, she felt seen through as if the woman knew more than she should. As they left, she looked back. Mrs. Langford was still standing there, her gaze like a shadow. "Who is she?" she asked. "The town banker," Thomas replied. "Also holds half the county's debt books." "And the other half mine," he said softly, without turning. Margaret was silent. On the way back, dusk fell over the hillsides. The last rays of the sun spread a deep red blanket over the land. The wind blew through the sage bushes, carrying the scent of resin and burnt grass. "Mr. Avery," Margaret said softly, "when you wrote in your letter that you were just a farmer, I believed it." Thomas smiled sadly. "And now you don't believe it." "No, it's not. But people look at you differently. They don't look at you as a poor man. In this part of the world," he said slowly, "you never really know who's poor and who's rich. Sometimes the people who have the most are the ones who have nothing left to lose." The words were like smoke lingering, haunting her mind all the way. It was dark when they reached the farmhouse. The house lamps were lit, casting a soft yellow glow like memories. Margaret helped Thomas unload the cart, then stopped to look out at the meadow. Distant lights flickered. Not houses. A fire, she asked. Thomas looked at it, his face suddenly tense. Maybe hunters. They're early in the woods this time of year, but she heard something uneasy in his voice. That evening, after a simple meal, Margaret sat by the fire, flipping through the old letter he had sent. The firelight illuminated each line. Each sentence was honest and simple, like a man who lived by work. But what she saw today made everything seem contradictory, the way people spoke, the reserved looks, the somewhat respectful greetings. She gently folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and whispered, "Mr. Avery, who are you outside?" The wind whistled through the window. The neighing of horses echoed in the distance, mingling with the faint thunder from the mountains. Margaret looked out into the darkness, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude for the protection and dread for what lay ahead. Sometimes, what we think is a peaceful beginning is just the opening act of a much darker story. The next morning, Margaret Ellison woke to a misty sky. Outside, the dawn poured down on the valley like honey, warm and cold gold. She heard the neighing of horses, the voices of men calling to each other in the far stables. Her vision was not yet accustomed to this vast land, and sometimes she thought she was dreaming that the train from Boston had not yet ended, that she was still a patchwork girl in a damp room in the city. But then the sound of wooden wheels on gravel brought her back to reality. Thomas Avery was getting the carriage ready. "We're going to look at the land," he said when she stepped onto the porch. "I want you to know where you're going to live." Margaret smiled, a mixture of excitement and shyness. "Is your farm far away?" "Not far, just over the hill." They left the small wooden house and followed the gently sloping dirt road. The sun rose higher, the mist cleared, revealing the landscape before them, and at that moment, Margaret fell silent. Before her was not the small farm she had imagined, but a vast expanse of land. Fence rows stretched far and wide, green pastures stretched to the horizon, dotted with large barns, red-roofed stables, and further in the middle of the vast land a two-story white stone mansion towering at the foot of the hill. Smoke rose from many chimneys, interspersed with the sound of hammers, wheels, and dozens of men working. Margaret blurted out, This is all yours." Thomas didn't answer right away. He just nodded slightly, his hands tightening on the reins. They walked through the driveway, lined with tall poplars. The hired men stopped and bowed as Thomas passed. The way they bowed, a mixture of respect and reverence, made Margaret's heart flutter. "You say you are a farmer," she whispered. "But what kind of farmer has a team like this?" Thomas turned, his eyes filled with regret. "You have every right to be angry with me. I didn't finish, but let me explain." She was silent. The carriage stopped before the mansion, a pale sandstone building with a black dome and round columns that had the look of a distant east. Everything here was exquisite, orderly, and breathtakingly foreign. Stepping inside, she was almost lost in another world. Red velvet carpet underfoot, oil paintings hanging along the staircase, and European-patterned brocade curtains. A silver-haired butler approached and bowed. "Welcome home, Master," and Madam Thomas hesitated. "Miss Ellison, my guest." The word sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Guest. The words echoed like a reminder that she did not belong here. They sat in the large living room, a fire burning in the hearth. Thomas poured tea, his voice soft. "I know I owe you an explanation. I used to be a farmer. Yes, But then the land around here fell into disuse after a big drought. I bought it up piece by piece, first just for hay, then for a blacksmith, then a workshop, and now you own Dawson's Ridge now," she continued. He smiled sadly. "Not quite. Just the south half. The other half belongs to someone else, and that's the part that never rests." She looked down at the teacup in her hand. "Why did you hide it from me? Because if you knew, you would never have come." The answer was so direct it made her choke. In his eyes, she saw the naked truth she was not the first person he had invited to this land. Perhaps he had been looking for a companion not for love, but for the desire to be trusted, even if only once more. In the afternoon, Margaret was given a tour of the farm. Everything seemed to be running smoothly. The black horses were being led to their stables. The workers were loading hay onto carts. But, in the midst of the peaceful scene, she sensed something was wrong. Curious glances, half-hearted greetings, and a few glances were exchanged as she passed. A middle-aged woman emerged from the kitchen, a wry smile on her face. "I'm Martha, the head housekeeper. You're Margaret. I'm from Boston." "Yes, Boston," she said, a flicker of something in her eyes, pity or warning. She couldn't tell. "The master doesn't bring anyone here often." The words were like a needle stabbing into her heart. Margaret smiled back and walked out into the backyard, where the last rays of sunlight were fading over the prairie. Before her, the mansion glowed in the sunset, breathtakingly beautiful, yet as cold as a fortress, and she realized she had not come to a small farm, but a territory, a place where power and secrets intertwined. Thomas stepped out and threw his coat around her shoulders. "It's cold, Mr. Avery," she said softly. "It's not the cold that scares me. It's the hidden things that scare me." He looked at her, his eyes lost in space. "Some things can't be kept hidden forever. Margaret, it's just, I hope you'll be strong enough to hear it all when the time comes." She nodded, but her heart was still heavy. In the distance, thunder rumbled like a storm drum. Wind blew across the fields, tossing her hair. The western sky was changing color, and she knew that what she thought was her destination was only the beginning of another journey, a journey to find out who the man before her really was. But before she could find the answer, Margaret realized sometimes the past isn't ready to face it. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Avery Homestead changed. It was no longer the stillness of the early morning prairie, but a thick silence as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. News of the Boston male bride spread throughout Dawson's Ridge in a matter of days. In the taverns, people whispered. In the church, widows exchanged puzzled glances, and on stagecoaches passing through town, Margaret Ellison's name rang out like a new story to gossip about in the coming winter. "You know, Mrs. Callahan, the grocer," whispered when Margaret stopped to buy flour. "People don't forget quickly in this part of the world. Every woman who comes into the Avery house leaves a mark." Margaret asked softly, "You mean, I'm not the first, Mrs. Callahan just smiled, her eyes alight with a vague pity. "No secret lasts forever. But be careful. There are names that should not be spoken in this town." That sentence haunted her all the way home. That afternoon, the wind blew hard. The wind whistled through the birches, making a cold sound. Thomas Avery left early, saying he had to meet the manager of the Western mine. Margaret stayed home, helping Martha clean the kitchen. Suddenly, there was the sound of galloping horses from outside the gate. From the window, She saw a group of horsemen, about 8 or 9 of them, approaching the mansion. Leading the way was a tall man in a black leather jacket and a red scarf around his neck. His eyes were as sharp as knives. "Martha, who is it?" The butler looked out, pale. "It's Samuel Drayton. He's here. Who is he?" "An old enemy of the Averys." Before Margaret could ask further, there was a loud knocking on the door. Thomas had just reached the gate. He dismounted, his face stony. "Drayton," he said, "I thought you had learned to let other people live." Drayton chuckled. "Other people, yes. But you are not other anymore. You are sitting on my land." The wind howled loudly, stirring up dust. Margaret stood behind the door, looking through the crack in the wood. Outside, Drayton threw down a sheaf of papers. "This is the original map of this area, signed in 1873. Your father, old Avery, forged the seal to claim the area south of Dry Creek. You know that, don't you? Thomas didn't move. Those rumors are old. Samuel, who would believe them? Do you—" Drayton smiled wickedly. "People believe a lot of things, especially when there's bloodshed. I hear you've brought a bride back from the east. Poor thing. She probably doesn't know she's walking into a wolf's den." Margaret felt her blood run cold. Thomas clenched his fists, his voice low. "Don't drag her into this. She was in it already," Drayton replied, and turned his horse away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Martha ran out and quickly closed the gate. "They'll be back, sir." "I know Drayton. He never stops with threats." Thomas nodded. "I know." Then he looked toward the door, where Margaret was standing. "I'm sorry you had to see this. That night, in the dining room, no one spoke." The firelight illuminated Thomas's face, tired, hard, and gloomy. "Finally," he said, "Samuel Drayton was my father's partner. When the land was subdivided, my father bought the worst part, and he took the riverside. Then, one night, there was a fire, the Drayton land was lost, the papers were missing, and people said my father was behind it." Margaret asked softly, "So what is the truth?" Thomas was silent. After a long while, he replied, "The truth? I'm not sure anymore. My father died young, and I only inherited what he left, right or wrong. People only remember the Avery name associated with sin." She looked at him. In the flickering light, he was no longer a man of power, but a man burdened with a heavy legacy. "Did you plan to live like that all your life?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Until you came," he replied, looking straight at her. The words left the room breathless, but in his voice, it wasn't a confession, but a confession that her presence forced him to face himself. 3 days later, rumors of the confrontation spread through Dawson's Ridge. Drayton was said to be gathering men, to have filed suit in county court. The workers at Avery Homestead grew nervous. Some began packing their belongings. Margaret walked across the yard and heard a whisper, "The new bride has arrived. I wonder how long she will live." She turned away, pretending not to hear, but each word was like a cold knife. As night fell, she watched out the window specks of light moving along the edge of the land, like will-o'-the-wisp. She wasn't sure if they were Drayton's men or just late farmers, but her instinct told her a real storm was coming. The next morning, Thomas left early, leaving a note on the table. "There are strangers camping to the east. Don't leave the house." Margaret read the words over and over again, feeling a mixture of fear and anger she had never known before. She realized she had been drawn into something bigger than a marriage. bigger than the fragile feelings between two strangers. She had stepped into the heart of a war where love, honor, and land were intertwined, where no one was completely innocent. In the afternoon, the wind blew so hard that the curtains banged against the wooden frame. Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the thick clouds gathering over the mountains. She whispered softly, as if talking to herself, "Perhaps peace has never been something people can find in this land. It is only a dream that we try to hold in our hands, even though we know that the wind will blow it away. And on that windy night, as the past rises from the ashes, Margaret will discover a secret no woman wants to hear about the man who came before her. The storm came earlier than expected. The wind tilted the fence posts and whipped up thick red dust on the dirt road leading to Avery Homestead. Inside, the fire burned brightly in the fireplace, but the warmth was not enough to dispel the chill that was creeping up inside Margaret Ellison. Thomas Avery returned after 3 days of absence. His clothes were muddy, his eyes tired. No one asked him any questions, and he said nothing. All evening he sat brooding by the window, looking out at the pitch-black prairie. The wind beat against the window pane, a steady, repetitive sound like the rhythm of an uneasy heartbeat. Finally, it was he who broke the silence. "Margaret," he said hoarsely, "there is something I must tell you, before anything else reaches your ears." She looked up. "What is it?" Thomas turned the silver ring in his hand, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Before you, there was another woman, also a male bride. Her name was Clara Monroe." The air in the room suddenly became thick. Margaret could hear the wind whistling through the crack in the door, as if waiting for her reaction. "Where is she now?" Thomas was silent for a long time, then replied softly she went missing. 3 years ago, Clara Monroe. The name rang in Margaret's mind like a bell from the distant past. Thomas told her interrupted, slowly, that Clara had come from Missouri, like herself, hoping for a new start. "She was sweet," he said, "and smarter than I thought. But after a few months, she began asking questions she shouldn't have about land, about Drayton, about my father's old maps." Margaret looked at him, and then, one autumn night, she disappeared. No goodbye, no trace. His voice was hoarse, but there was something in his eyes, regret or fear that she couldn't name. "They say," Thomas continued, "she ran off with the Draytons, but others say," he paused, his hands clenching into fists, "that the Averys made her disappear." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you believe that?" "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "I didn't hurt her, but—" He paused, his voice trailing off. "I can't prove otherwise." In the days that followed, Margaret drifted between dreams and waking dreams. Whenever she walked down the hallway, she felt as if someone were watching her. In the east room, which had been locked, she heard the door creak at night, even though the wind had died down. Martha said it was just the wind, but Margaret knew there was something else hidden within the thick walls of the building. One afternoon, while cleaning out her old bookroom, she found a small notebook hidden between 2 shelves. The cover was faintly printed with the initials C.M. Clara Monroe. The first page is in soft italics. The step was beautiful, but its silence frightened me. I began to understand that the vast fields concealed not only the secrets of the earth, but also of people. The next page contained dates, observations on the land register, numbers she did not fully understand, and on the last page, a brief farewell note. If I'm no longer here, remember that the truth is not in what people say, but in what they don't. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She took the book down to the living room, opposite Thomas. The fire crackled, casting a red flickering light on his face. You said she disappeared, she began, but I think she left something behind. Thomas looked at the book in her hand as if he had seen a ghost. Where did you find it? In the library, between two ledgers. You know it's there, don't you? He was silent. She opened the last page and pointed to the hastily written words. What does she know about this land? Thomas. His face showed a flash of pain, real and deep. You don't understand. This land, it belonged to the native families before the government divided it. My father didn't choose the fair way. As for me, I inherited both the guilt and the blood. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. She looked at him, the man she had trusted, the man she had thought she could rely on, as if he were now carrying a wound that would never heal. And Clara knew that he nodded, his eyes heavy. She intended to give the documents to Pinkerton, then disappeared before she could. Margaret stepped back, her heart pounding. So if they say you killed her... Thomas looked up, his gaze pained. You believe it too? I don't know what to believe. The distance between them was now wider than the field outside. That night, Margaret sat by the window, a small notebook on her pillow. The wind picked up again, blowing the curtains open and stirring memories that were not hers. Questions swirled in her head. If Clara was murdered, who did it? If it wasn't Thomas, then who in this house was hiding a bloody secret? Moonlight streamed down a long hallway, where a door opened and closed softly. She stood, walking slowly. The wood creaked under her feet. The sound of her breathing mingled with the beat of her heart. When her hand touched the doorknob, a cold breath blew out, and in that moment she felt as if someone had passed by, whispering a name in her ear. Clara. Margaret turned, but the corridor was empty. Only the wind howled out in the prairie long, sad, and carrying the ashes of stories untold. As dawn broke over Dawson's Ridge, Margaret understood that the truth lay not in rumors, but in the shadows of this house, waiting for her to find it. That morning, the fog was so thick that the path to the gate was barely visible. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of burnt grass and rust, the smell that comes with the changing of the seasons. Margaret Ellison put on a sweater and stepped out onto the porch. On the table, someone had left the local newspaper, still damp with dew. The headline, in italics, read Pinkerton reopens case of missing Clara Monroe. Suspected link to Wyoming land corruption. Margaret picked up the newspaper, her heart pounding. The name Pinkerton, the famous private detective agency, filled her with both fear and curiosity. The article was short, but filled with details that made her shudder. The writer claimed that Clara Monroe was no ordinary mail bride, but a secret agent sent to investigate the Avery family, suspecting their involvement in a large-scale land-grabbing ring that had lasted for a decade. At the end of the article, an excerpt from the unverified file states Clara Monroe gathered evidence that the Avery family used their power to dry up the water supply in the West End, force people out, and then buy it back at a low price. Her reporting stopped abruptly before she disappeared. The newspaper fell from Margaret's hand. A chill ran down her spine, even though the morning sun was beginning to filter through the mist. She remembered the notebook Clara had left her, the numbers, the fragments of writing, the symbols she had once dismissed as unimportant. Now they all seemed to piece together into a terrifying picture. That same afternoon, Samuel Drayton appeared at the gate. This time he was not alone. He was accompanied by 3 men in long coats with metal badges on their chests. Margaret recognized him at once, Pinkerton men. Thomas Avery waited for them in the courtyard, his face expressionless. Drayton held up the file, his voice even. "Mr. Avery, I believe you remember Clara Monroe. She used to live here, right?" Thomas nodded slightly. "She was my wife." "No," Drayton replied, a crooked smile on his face. "She was our agent, and she collected evidence of how you and your father took over the land, poisoned the people's water supply, and staged accidents to cover your tracks." Martha stood on the porch, her hands shaking. Margaret hid behind the door, her heart pounding so hard she couldn't breathe. Thomas shot Drayton a cold look. "You're always good at making up stories, Samuel. Who did you find to write your script this time?" Drayton did not reply, but placed the stack of papers on the wooden table in the yard. One of the 3 Pinkertons opened the file and pulled out some faded photos, land maps, deeds, and a photo of Clara Monroe, brown hair, serious face, standing next to a land survey with a government seal. "This is the woman who used to live in your house, right?" Thomas looked at the photo for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Yes, it is her. But I don't know anything about her being an agent." "Really?" Drayton tilted his head, his voice tinged with mockery. "Then why did she disappear the day you filed your claim to the Dry Creek estate? Why did Pinkerton find traces of blood in the eastern warehouse?" Thomas clenched his fists. "I didn't kill her." Drayton smiled coldly. "Don't believe me. The law will decide." That night, after they left, Margaret sat by the window, looking out at the dark shadows of the meadow. Everything was spinning in her head. Clara was a secret agent. Thomas was accused of murder. And this house, the place where she thought she would find peace, was the center of an unsolved crime. Thomas entered the room, his face gaunt. "I need you to trust me, Margaret." She turned back, her voice trembling slightly. "You lied to me from the beginning. You hid Clara. You hid the past. Because I was afraid," he said, his voice breaking. "Afraid that when you found out, you would leave me like everyone else. And Clara, she trusted you too, didn't she?" Thomas didn't answer. One look was enough to tell her he had never stopped obsessing over that woman. Margaret stood up, took a step back. "I need to know the truth. Not just about her, about you, about everything." The next day, while Thomas was out meeting his lawyer, Margaret reopened Clara's notebook. At the back, she discovered a folded sheet of paper tucked under the cover, a handwritten copy of a letter to Pinkerton. "Never sent. If I don't come back, know that they're doing worse than we thought. Not just taking land, they're polluting the water to drive out the indigenous people. I'm afraid Thomas isn't entirely innocent either." The pen stopped mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. The last line contained only 3 words. They knew. Margaret clutched the paper, feeling her heart constrict. She remembered Martha's eyes, the guarded look from the maid, the sudden shutting of doors as she passed. Everyone in the house knew something and everyone was silent. She realized something terrifying. Clara disappeared because she had come across a truth they didn't want to be revealed. And now, she, Margaret, was walking the same path again. As dusk fell, a heavy rain began to fall, pouring down on the slate roof. Margaret stood by the window, her tears mixing with the cold air. In the distance, she saw the lights of the stables flickering. Someone was moving. In the shadow of the rain, the figure looked eerily familiar. Has the past never left this place? Or is she walking the story of a woman who disappeared because she dared to speak the truth? She whispered softly, almost a prayer. Clara, I won't let them make you disappear again. But before Margaret can discover the truth, the darkness within this very house begins to stir, and the person behind Clara's tragedy approaches, bearing an unexpected confession. The rain that night swept across Dawson's Ridge as if the sky were washing away all traces of the past. In the morning, the ground was still wet, the poplars were covered in dew, but inside Avery homestead, the air was heavier than ever. News of the Pinkerton file spread so quickly that no one dared to speak aloud. That afternoon, Margaret was called down to the drawing room, which she had seldom entered since her arrival. The room was large and opulent, with a high, dark oak ceiling and heavy wine-colored velvet curtains. The light from the windows fell on the faces of the people sitting in a circle. On the right stood Beatrice Avery, Thomas's aunt, the woman everyone knew controlled the family finances. Her face was cold as porcelain, her silver hair tied in a bun, a string of pearls around her wrists. Opposite her was Lillian, Thomas's young cousin, in her early 20s, her eyes bright but with a hidden eagerness. At the other end of the table, stern and calm, was Richard Halloway, the rival rancher, a man with a gaze as deep as the night, once considered an old friend of Thomas's. Margaret understood that this meeting was not for her, but Mrs. Beatrice had ordered Miss Ellison must be present. She is part of the story, whether she wants to or not. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his back straight, his eyes low. Beatrice spoke, her voice sharp as a knife. We've kept quiet long enough. Miss Monroe, the agent, or your wife, whatever you call her, has put a stain on the Avery name. And now you've brought home another male bride, while we're under investigation. Are you planning to turn this house into a haven for all sorts of strangers? Thomas replied slowly. Margaret has nothing to do with my past. She just wants to live in peace. Beatrice laughed dryly. Peace. No one is safe here. She arrived just as Pinkerton was returning. The newspapers were buzzing. Drayton was rallying his men, and you call it a coincidence. Don't be naive. Thomas, either she was naive or she was sent, like Clara. Margaret stood up, her voice trembling but firm. I am not Clara Monroe. I do not work for anyone. I just want to know the truth. Beatrice turned around, her eyes piercing. The truth is, you have mistakenly stepped into the wrong place. Lillian spoke now, her voice sweet but cold. Miss Beatrice, perhaps Mr. Thomas does not see it, but Miss Ellison also knows how to attract pity. A man in a state of breakdown always needs a gentle hand, even if only temporarily. Margaret bit her lip and did not reply. She could feel everyone's eyes on her like a cornered prey. Richard Halloway spoke suddenly, his voice low and soft as poison. Perhaps everyone is lost. The issue is not Miss Ellison, but the future of this land. If the Averys fall, there will be no one to control Dry Creek. I can guarantee your safety. Miss Ellison, if you will leave this place, I need a woman who understands what is worth keeping secret. Thomas turned sharply, his voice harsh. Are you trying to bribe her? Richard shrugged. It's not bribery. It's negotiation. In these times, everyone needs a way out. I'm just giving her a chance before this place burns down. Margaret looked at him, her heart in turmoil, a chance for what to be someone else's wife, in exchange for safety. He smiled, a smile that was both pitying and arrogant. "You're in a house with blood on the walls. Miss Ellison, I think safety is something worth buying, if you can afford it." The air was thick. The wind outside pounded against the doorframe, making a groaning sound like the sighing earth. Thomas stood up, slamming his hand on the table. "Enough. This is my house. None of you are allowed to hurt her." Beatrice remained silent, only picked up her teacup, took a sip, and said softly, "Your house, Thomas. Have you forgotten that all the papers are still in my name? And, when the authorities come to investigate, who will protect you? A girl who knows nothing about the past, or an old enemy who wants to take everything?" Thomas was silent. "Mrs. Beatrice put down her teacup, the sound small but resonant in the quiet space. "I told you, Margaret Ellison is nothing but trouble. If she's smart, she'll leave before this place becomes a second grave." Margaret looked around the room. The portraits on the walls seemed to be watching, their oil-painted eyes cold. She suddenly understood that the people here did not live together. They existed together, ruthless and wary. Family, honor, power, all were just masks. She turned to Thomas. "You want me to believe you are innocent, but your own people see me as guilty. Who should I believe?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with both helplessness and pleading. "Believe what you see in me, not what they say." She shook her head slightly. "I see a man losing himself." When the meeting ended, everyone left the room, leaving only Margaret. She stood in the middle of the large room, watching the dying fire. A feeling of utter loneliness rose in her heart, not because she was hated, but because she realized she was drifting in a whirlpool of calculations where no one was being honest with anyone. She understood that, from this moment on, the truth was no longer something to be found, but something to be fought for. Outside, dusk was slowly falling. A wind blew through the half-closed door, rustling the red velvet curtains. In the dim yellow light, Beatrice's face in the portrait on the wall seemed to smile a smile both proud and cold as steel. But that night, as darkness fell across the fields, Margaret would understand that the real enemy was not only out there, but was pacing silently within the halls of this very mansion. That night, the wind whistled around Avery homestead like the breath of an old spirit, seeping through every crack in the door, stirring the red curtains darkened with time. The house smelled of wax candles, smoke, and worry. Margaret sat in the living room where only hours before, Aunt Beatrice's cold condemnation, Lillian's sarcasm, and Richard Halloway's false pity had echoed. Now, there was only silence and the flickering oil lamp on the wooden table. Thomas stood silently by the window, his shoulders heavy. "You shouldn't listen to them," he said softly. "They just want to tear us apart," Margaret replied, her voice strangely calm. "No one needs to separate what doesn't belong together. Mr. Avery." Thomas turned, his eyes dark. "You doubt me." "No," she said, her eyes calm but deep. "I don't doubt I want to know." Outside, the wind was getting stronger. The door banged against the wall, making a screeching sound. Beatrice entered, holding a silver cane, her face as cold as a statue. Behind her stood Lillian, her eyes eager as if she had just seen a play. "What does she really want to know?" Beatrice asked sarcastically. "About Miss Monroe, about the Pinkertons, or about how the family survives on blood and lies?" Thomas gritted his teeth. "Miss Beatrice, enough. Not yet," she replied. "As long as this new bride is here, there will be trouble. She is bait. Thomas, just like Clara." Lillian smiled slightly. Maybe she is even more clever. Knows how to make a guilty man believe that he is forgiven. Margaret stood up and walked slowly to the center of the room. The lamplight fell on her face, slender, pale, but determined. "You say I'm like Clara," she said, but at least she dared to ask questions, to face them. "What about you all these years? Hiding the truth for this fortune. For a little empty honor, that's the crime." Beatrice frowned. "You don't know who you're talking to." "No," Margaret replied. "I know better than anyone. I'm talking to people who have forgotten what makes a man worthy." A thunderclap exploded in the distance. The oil lamp on the table suddenly swayed. Richard Halloway, who had been standing still all this time, spoke in a voice as deep and heavy as Earth Miss Ellison. "I admire your courage, but in this land, the truth does not save anyone. It only makes people die sooner." She looked at him. "In that case, I would rather die than live in fear." Beatrice jumped up, her voice sharp as steel. Enough, she swung her hand and slammed it hard on the table. The teacup fell, and the oil lamp fell with it, crashing onto the tiled floor. The sound of breaking was deafening. Oil splattered, and the fire flared up fiercely in the middle of the room, its light reflecting off the discolored faces. At that moment, no one knew whether it was intentional or not. Margaret grabbed the silver cane from Beatrice's hand and slammed it down on the floor. A loud bang echoed. The lamp shattered completely, and smoke and fire rose up. "None of you leave," her voice echoed throughout the room. "I want the whole truth, and I will not take another step until it is told." The room was silent. Only the crackling of the fire remained. In the dim light, Margaret's face glowed strangely, not with anger, but with a newfound strength. She was no longer the timid woman lost in rumors and suspicious glances. Now she was the only one with dignity in this house haunted by lies. Thomas looked at her, his eyes wavering between surprise and admiration. "It's not as simple as you think," he said softly. "Let me see the complexity for myself," she replied. "With my own eyes." Beatrice turned away, her voice cold. "The truth is sometimes the worst thing to know." Margaret smiled faintly. "No, madam, hiding it is the worst." Thomas then ordered the fire to be put out. Everyone dispersed, but no one said another word. Only Margaret stood there, watching the fire die down, feeling that another fire had been lit in her heart, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. That night, she packed her belongings into a small cloth bag and hid it under her bed, not to run away, but to prepare for what was to come, something she knew no one else would dare do but her. She sat down at the table and wrote in Clara's old notebook, "If I disappear, know that I chose to stare straight into the darkness, instead of hiding in someone else's spotlight." Then she closed the book. Her eyes turned to the window where the rain had just stopped, but the wind still blew relentlessly across the meadow. The next morning, while Beatrice and Lillian were still asleep, Margaret stepped out of the house. A pale dawn was settling over the prairie. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, reminding her that the world outside was still going on, even as this place was rotting in secret. She took a deep breath, her hand tightening on the notebook Clara had left behind. She knew now that she was no longer the one in between. She was the only one brave enough to find the truth. And if that truth brought ruin, then that was the price of freedom. But as Margaret begins to search for answers in old maps and surviving letters, she doesn't know that at the same time. The real culprit is watching her every step, waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, the wind blew up the hill from Dry Creek, carrying with it a cold mist of water and the smell of burnt grass. Avery Homestead was dark, except for a few oil lamps flickering in the hallway, casting a faint yellow glow on the thick, dusty walls. Margaret sat alone in her study, facing a pile of old papers, records, contracts, letters from the Avery family that she had just found in a secret drawer behind a large mirror. Each sheet bore Beatrice Avery's mark, a thin, decisive signature, accompanied by a cold note. Keep quiet, pay within the week. She read it over and over again until her eyes stung. A name emerged from the dry lines, Clara Monroe. Beside it was written in a thin, slanted hand, seemingly in Beatrice's own. She knows too much. Deal with her. Margaret felt the blood stop flowing. The paper trembled in her hand. A strong wind blew through the crack in the door, swaying the lamp, the light falling on her face pale and dazed. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow, steady, heavy. She turned, holding her breath. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, thin, in a black cloak, silver hair pinned with a pearl brooch. "Are you still awake?" Beatrice Avery's voice was low but clear. Margaret gently put the paper down on the table, trying to keep her voice calm. "Yes. I was reading something about Clara." Beatrice entered, her lamp illuminating the room. "She was a good girl," she said slowly. "I liked her, but sometimes liking is a luxury when family honor is at stake." Margaret looked straight at her. "So, what do you do when you're threatened?" Aunt Beatrice paused at the window, her fingers tapping lightly on the wood frame. "I defend the Avery name as I have all my life." She understood at once. The answer didn't need to be said. "You killed her," Margaret said softly, almost in a whisper. Beatrice turned, her eyes strangely bright. "I only stopped her from destroying everything. You don't understand. One false accusation could have cost hundreds of people their jobs, left this land in the hands of speculators, left the Avery name in the dust. I chose the lesser evil." Margaret stepped back, her heart pounding. "You call that the lesser of two evils. Don't judge when you've never been forced to stand between honor and ruin. But it's a human life, ma'am." "It's the price of silence," Beatrice replied, her eyes unblinking. In that moment, all her elegance, authority, and composure vanished. In its place, a woman consumed by fear and vanity emerged. The door swung open. Thomas Avery entered, his face pale at the sight before him. "Oh, God, Mother," he whispered. Beatrice turned sharply, her voice sharp. "I must not interfere. How many more lies must I hear?" Thomas stepped forward, snatched the paper from Margaret's hand, skimmed it, and looked straight at her. "I suspected, but I did not want to believe. Mother, you made Clara disappear." Beatrice was silent. After a moment, she said slowly, word by word, "You don't understand. Thomas, I did it for you, for this house." Thomas stepped back, his eyes broken. "No, she did it for herself, for her own sick pride. Clara didn't threaten us. She only sought justice." "Justice," Beatrice laughed, her voice distorted. "What justice exists in this land? Here. There are only the strong and the buried." Margaret looked at them, feeling as if she were witnessing a tragedy falling apart before her eyes. Thomas let go, the paper falling to the floor. You killed an innocent person, then forced us to live on her blood." Beatrice tightened her grip on the silver cane, her voice low. "If I hadn't done that, you would have been thrown into prison. Clara had enough evidence to destroy the whole family. I saved you." Thomas shook his head slightly, his eyes filled with despair. "No, you just made me a person who lived off the sins of others." The room was silent. Only the wind whistled through the window, carrying the chill of the autumn night. Margaret stood there, her heart breaking. The woman who had once invited her for tea, who had once asked her kindly, now admitted to taking a life to protect her reputation. And the man she had tried to trust, Thomas, was crumbling before her eyes, no longer knowing where to trust and where to sin. Beatrice looked at her son, her voice low and trembling. "Thomas, I am old. Everything I do is for you. You may hate me, but you will understand when you have lost everything. It is your honor that people remember." "No," said Thomas. "People only remember what you have done to others." She smiled sadly. "Remember that, my son." Then she turned to Margaret, her eyes full of warning. "And you, little bride, be careful. The truth may save you, but it may also bury you with Clara." With that, she quietly walked out, the shadow of her black cloak blending into the dim hallway. Thomas sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "Now you see," he said, his voice choking, "evil does not always wear the face of an enemy. Sometimes it wears the mask of love." Margaret put her hand gently on his shoulder. "And true love," she said softly, "begins when you dare to face what you don't want to believe." Outside, the rain began to fall again. The wind tilted the lamp, casting the shadows of 3 people on the wall, like 3 souls trapped between the past. Guilt and fading faith. Margaret understood then what she had just witnessed was not just a confession, but the beginning of the collapse not by gunfire or fire, but by a truth that had been buried for too long. That night, the sky over Dawson's Ridge was no longer the quiet darkness of the west, but a blazing curtain, rent by the sound of hooves, torches, and the screams of rising justice. As Margaret tried to reassure Thomas Avery after Beatrice's confession, the sound of galloping horses came from afar. Heavy hooves echoed across the windy fields and cliffs. The windows of the Avery homestead were lit by the red glow of approaching torches. The silhouettes of riders appeared on the thin snow-black cloaks, silver badges glinting on their chests. "Pinkerton," someone shouted from outside the gate, amid the howling wind. Agent Henry Dalton rode ahead, his face half in torchlight, half in shadow, his eyes sharp as knives. Behind him, a team of agents carried pistols and sealed files. A scream rang out from inside. The servant hurried to close the door, but it was too late. 3 heavy knocks sounded, and then the great door swung open, and a gust of wind rushed in, carrying with it ashes and the smell of gunpowder. Beatrice Avery stood in the middle of the hall, her black dress fluttering, her silver staff still clutched in her hand. She looked at Dalton, showing no fear, just a faint smile, the smile of someone used to being in a position of power. "So you've come at last," she said, her voice cold as steel. "I've been waiting for this day." Dalton stepped forward and pulled out a warrant. "By order of the Helena District Court, Beatrice Avery is hereby arrested for murder, bribery, and embezzlement." Thomas was stunned. "Oh my God." Margaret looked around, her heart pounding. She could feel the tension building, the collapse of old power. the tightening grip of justice. Beatrice chuckled. "You think you can defeat me with those papers? You have no idea how many secrets I keep in this land." Dalton looked at her impassively, but his hands were already at his gun belt. "We don't need your secrets. We have proof. From behind." An agent stepped forward and placed thick envelopes sealed with red wax on the table. Dalton opened them, revealing photographs and handwritten letters, land maps, forged contracts, and bribe receipts signed by Beatrice. The room fell silent. Thomas was petrified, his eyes blank as he stared at the evidence that had stripped his family naked. Beatrice trembled slightly, but then her eyes turned fierce. "You don't understand," she said hoarsely. "Everything I did was to protect Avery Homestead. Without me, it would have all fallen into the hands of speculators." Long ago, Dalton didn't answer. He placed the last photograph on the table, a picture of a brown-haired woman with a gentle smile standing in front of Dry Creek Field. Beneath it were the words Clara Monroe. Pinkerton, agent disappeared, 1888. Beatrice paled. "Who gave you permission to bring her here?" Margaret clenched her fists. Clara did not return, but she did. "Madam." Suddenly, Beatrice pulled a small derringer from her coat and pointed it at Dalton. It all happened in an instant, the scream, the clang of metal. But before she could pull the trigger, Margaret Ellison rushed forward, knocking the wooden table over, the oil lamp spilling onto the floor, the flames flaring up, illuminating the room. "No," she shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. "Enough. No more blood." Beatrice collapsed, the gun falling from her hand. Dalton immediately approached, raised his gun, and signaled for the arrest. The firelight reflected off Beatrice's face, no majesty now. There was only a tired, old woman, watching the rising flames as if she were seeing her own fading reflection. Thomas knelt down and tried to hold his mother's hand. "Mother, please." She chuckled, tears streaming down her hard face. "I just wanted to keep some honor for this family, but perhaps true honor died with Clara." Margaret bowed low and said, "No, Madam. Honor remains when we dare to tell the truth." Madame Beatrice looked at her, her eyes flashing with the last light, then faded. She let go of her hand. Dalton stepped forward and signaled for the firemen to put out the fire. "There is nothing more to hide," he said softly. "Everything will be brought before the court." Margaret stood in the middle of the ash-covered hall and took a deep breath. She could feel the heat, the smell of smoke, and the feeling of being stripped away as if the whole land had been cleansed by fire. Thomas turned to her, his voice low. "Thank you, Margaret. Without you, I might not have dared to look at my mother at all." She replied slowly, "Sometimes you have to let the darkness burn out before you can see the light again. Mr. Avery." Outside, dawn was beginning to light the snow-covered hillsides. The Pinkertons had departed, leaving the mansion in a thin cloud of smoke. Margaret watched Beatrice's carriage drive away, her heart heavy as if she had carried the winter with her. Dalton came to her and said softly, "Justice never comes gently, but it does come." Margaret nodded slightly, her eyes following the fading torches, and perhaps that is the only thing that gives people hope. The Wyoming wind blew, lingering with the smell of smoke and lingering warmth. The night was over, and with it an old era, and as the dawn light poured down on the dark roofs of Mercer Estate, the smoke of the guns faded, leaving only the sound of horses breathing and the pungent smell of ash in the air. Every word, every lie, was now irrevocably exposed by the light. That morning, Silver Creek was strangely quiet. There was no sound of hammering from the railroad yard, no hawking, no music from the corner tavern. The small town held its breath, waiting to hear the verdict of fate in the Mercer estate. Once a symbol of power and wealth, only sporadic footsteps echoed. The dark red velvet curtains were still drawn, but the dust of battle had not been wiped away, and the smell of gunpowder still lingered on the wooden floor. Evelyn sat by the window, her thin hands holding a cup of cold tea. On the table was a document stamped by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, an invitation to leave Wyoming, to go east, to start a new life, safe, free from the past. Next to it was an affidavit to testify in court against those who had manipulated the land, forced people off the farm, poisoned the well, and covered up Clara Monroe's death. The wind gently shook the curtains. Evelyn looked up into the distance where the dry creek fields stretched out in the mist. A month ago, she'd come here with a timid heart, hoping for a peaceful home. Now, she understood. Home was not the four walls, but the feeling of peace in her own conscience. The door opened. Agent Henry Dalton entered, his hat askew, his coat muddy. He bowed slightly. "The town awaits you, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice low but soft. "I'm here to escort you. If you sign the release form, the train will take you to Denver tomorrow morning. Everything here you can forget it." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes steady. "And if I stay, you'll have to testify," Dalton said. "That means putting yourself in danger. The people involved in the land grab. No one wants the truth told. You'll have to face the people who once owned this whole place." She pursed her lips. "I've faced them, Mr. Dalton. I've just never been given a choice." Dalton looked at her for a long time, then nodded slightly. "Then, this time, let the choice be yours." It was noon, the Wyoming sky clear, the sun shining on the tin roof of the mansion. In the backyard, a team of Pinkerton investigators was sealing up chests of documents, debt books, land maps, Beatrice's handwritten letters, evidence of a series of abuses of power. A few steps away, Daniel Mercer, once a symbol of wealth and power in Silver Creek, sat quietly in the shade of a tree, his wrists bound. There was no pride in his sunburned face, only weariness and something like serenity. As Evelyn approached, he looked up. "They said you could go," he said softly. "You should leave. I don't want you to get dragged into this anymore." She sat down opposite, her voice gentle. "No one can leave if there's something left unsaid." Daniel was silent. After a long moment, he sighed softly. "I knew what my mother did, but I chose to remain silent. I told myself it was honorable to remain silent, but really, it was cowardice." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes slightly red. "You can do the right thing now." He nodded. "I told Dalton I will go to court. I will tell everything. If justice requires a scapegoat for the truth, let it be me." She squeezed his hand. "Maybe for once, you're doing the right thing." Daniel smiled, sad and gentle. "Maybe. Thank you. Evelyn, you've shown me that not all who come from far away are doomed. Sometimes they give a person a chance to start over, however late." Evening fell. A light wind blew across the fields, carrying the scent of wormwood and damp earth. Evelyn watched as Daniel was led away toward the police car. He turned once, nodding briefly a farewell. Dalton stepped forward, his voice slow. He'll be in Cheyenne 10 years, if he cooperates. Evelyn nodded, her eyes still on him. And the others. We've started investigations into the railroads, into the land commissioners back east. You've done what many people wouldn't dare do. Mrs. Mercer, you've made the system answer. It's not because I'm braver, she replied softly. It's just that I've lost enough to understand that, without justice, no one can ever truly be at peace. That night, Evelyn returned to the old room where Clara Monroe had written her last diary entries. She placed the witness statement on the table, next to an old photograph found in Clara's trunk, a smiling young woman standing in front of a field with her hair blown by the wind. She took a pen and signed her name, Evelyn Mercer. The candle flame flickered, and the wax dripped onto the paper, leaving a faint trace of light, an indelible mark of determination. Dalton stepped in from the porch and said softly, "The train leaves tomorrow morning, but if you change your mind, there's room for you." Evelyn turned, smiling slightly. "I'll stay. There are souls to be laid to rest, and I owe them that." Dalton looked at her for a long time, then simply said, "I hope Wyoming will treat you well." That night, the train whistle sounded in the distance, echoing over the hills. Evelyn went out onto the porch and watched the golden light of the engine disappear over the horizon. In the sky, the stars began to appear quietly, steadily, like the faith she had found again after so much loss. She whispered softly, as if to Clara, "To all those who had fallen for the truth justice does not come from the strong, but from those who dare not be silent." And in that moment, Silver Creek land of storm and sin seemed to breathe a sigh of relief for the first time in years. But that winter, as the snow blanketed the prairies and the first trains rolled through Wyoming, Evelyn would receive a letter from Cheyenne Prison, where Daniel Mercer wrote her his last words of redemption. In January 1891, the Helena County Courthouse was blanketed in snow. The eyes of the entire town of Silver Creek were fixed on the red brick building where the months-long court hearing was finally taking place. Since early morning, people had been pouring in, their sleeves covered in ice, their eyes on the large wooden doors where the sentries stood at attention. Inside, in the cold, dense air, Beatrice Mercer, the woman who had once been the symbol of power in the region, sat upright, her hands trembling slightly in her frayed lace gloves. There were no pearls on her collar, no longer the arrogant gaze of yesteryear. There was only a naked person before justice. Evelyn Mercer sat in the witness box. She wore a simple gray dress with a silver pin at the collar. Her face was calm, but there was a silence in her eyes as if each word was a knife slicing into her memory. The judge banged his gavel 3 times. The dry echo echoed off the high ceiling. The trial lasted 4 days. Testimony, letters, and papers seized from the Mercer estate were read aloud. Wyoming fell silent as the revelations of corruption spread from railroad contractors to local officials all the way to the federal government office in Helena. Clara Monroe's name was mentioned again and again, not just as a victim, but as a light that illuminated the darkness. She had been a Pinkerton agent, sent to investigate those very wrongs, and it was the truth she held that had cost her life at the hands of the woman sitting there now, the woman who had taught Evelyn how to pour tea and smile at dinner. Evelyn was called to the witness stand on the 3rd day. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, slow but sure. When asked why she hadn't left Wyoming after the investigation, she simply said, "Because justice is not something that others can hand to us, it is something we must dare to stand up for." The room fell silent at that remark. For a brief moment, even the wind outside seemed to stop blowing. When the verdict was announced, Beatrice Mercer did not look around. She just raised her head, her eyes dry. "Death," the judge said, "for attempted murder and concealment." A soft gasp rose from the crowd. Evelyn closed her eyes. Aunt Beatrice turned to look at her one last time. There was no resentment, just a sad look, the sadness of someone who had lived too long in the illusion of honor. "You have won," she said softly, her voice breaking. "No," Evelyn replied. "I have not won. It is just the truth at last seen." The investigation didn't stop there. Big names began to emerge: land commissioners, railroad contractors, tax officials. A web of corruption reached Washington. Newspapers in Montana and Nebraska picked up on the story. Agent Henry Dalton, the head of the Pinkerton gang, became a celebrated figure for his 2-year pursuit of evidence. But when asked by reporters, he would only say, "If it weren't for the courage of one woman named Evelyn Mercer, justice would have been buried forever under the Wyoming ice." A week after the trial, when the snow had stopped falling, Evelyn received the letter, a thick envelope, in dark blue ink, sent from Cheyenne State Prison. She opened the letter, and Daniel Mercer's slanted handwriting appeared, shaky but clear. "Evelyn, I don't know if, when you read this, I'm still a free person in my heart. I've betrayed many things: land, honor, and even myself. But perhaps God has sent you here, so that I can see that goodness still exists in this sinful land." I signed over 160 acres of Raven Hill land north of Silver Creek, where the sun first hits each morning. It was the only part I owned legally, without blood or greed. I want you to keep it, not as an asset, but as a new beginning. Use it to replant what we have destroyed and to live, instead of just survive. Daniel. Evelyn read the letter over and over again. As she folded it, her fingers brushed the accompanying transfer slip, the red seal clearly bearing the words, "Raven Hill Tract Number E, 12. Outside, the sky was turning purple. She went out onto the porch, where the snow was beginning to melt, running in small streams over the wooden steps. In the distance, horses pulling carts carrying people passed by, the steady sound of their hooves echoing like the slow heartbeat of the reviving frontier. She looked up at the sky, where the last light of day reflected off the white snow, and smiled slightly. Not the smile of victory, but of someone who understood that justice does not end with a sentence, but begins with a change in each person. That night, sitting alone by the fire, Evelyn took out Clara Monroe's old notebook and opened it to the last page. She added a line in small handwriting, just below the dead woman's unfinished notes. "Justice lies not in the court, but in the hands that sow in winter." Then she closed the book and looked at the firelight on the wall. In the howling wind outside, she thought she could hear the train moving away, carrying the past away from Silver Creek, leaving only those brave enough to start again. 3 months later, on a spring morning, as the first daisies bloomed on the slopes of Raven Hill, Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps, watching the Wyoming sunrise where she began her new journey. No longer as someone's correspondent bride, but as the writer of her own story. The sun had just risen over Bitterroot Ridge, casting a soft golden glow over the town of Silver Creek. The dew-dampened wooden roofs glittered as if sprinkled with crystal dust. On the steps of the Helena County Courthouse, Evelyn stood still, her arms around a stack of documents, taking a deep breath, letting the late spring chill seep through her thin coat and into her chest. 3 months ago, this place had been a battlefield of fear, of devastation, and of testimony that had shaken Wyoming. Now, in that fragile peace, Evelyn realized life has a way of returning, like grass after snow melts. She is now a secretary in the Helena County Prosecutor's Office, a job that is not glamorous but enough to make her feel useful. Every morning, she copies minutes, organizes files, listens to people's small lawsuits, land disputes, timber debts, and sometimes old stories that no one wants to talk about anymore. Somewhere in those papers, she still recognizes the shadow of herself, the person who was once submerged in the whirlpool of power without knowing how to speak up. Now, the gavel no longer frightened her. It was like the heartbeat of justice, steady, patient, impartial. And it was here that Evelyn chose to begin again. At noon, she left the courthouse and walked toward Raven Hill. The red dirt road was still wet with dew, and on both sides were vast fields of pale green grass. In the distance, the wooden house she had built with a few new friends appeared modest, simple, but with smoke from the stove and the neighing of horses in the stable. Raven Hill, the land Daniel Mercer had left behind, had changed hands. No longer a mark of sin, but a symbol of a new beginning. Evelyn had not used it for commercial farming, as was advised. She planted barley, a few flower beds, and opened a small house to shelter lost women. Anyone can start over, she would tell them, if only you are no longer afraid of the light. One weekend afternoon, while Evelyn was recording the land, Agent Henry Dalton stopped by. He had a grayer beard and a worn leather jacket, but his eyes were still kind. "You did a good job, Mrs. Mercer," he said, looking around the green land. Evelyn smiled slightly. "I'm not Mrs. Mercer anymore. Mr. Dalton, I'm just Evelyn." Dalton nodded, a small smile flickering. "I guess so. But to be honest, few people have the courage to stay and live on. Many people, after seeing all that, leave Wyoming forever. As for me," she replied, her voice slow and steady, "I've found a place where I belong, not because of land, but because of faith. I don't want to leave anymore." They were silent for a moment, looking out at the horizon, where melting snow was revealing the purple mountains. Dalton said softly, "Some say Wyoming is unforgiving, but I think it only tests those who dare to love it." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes deep and warm, like people. Dalton left late in the afternoon. Evelyn watched him disappear behind the pines, then returned to the house. On the table was Daniel's old letter. The edges were blurred, but the words were still clear. "Use this soil to replant what we have destroyed." She gently stroked the words, then put the letter in the drawer where she kept the mementos of the past. Not to forget, but to remind herself that mistakes should be remembered, because they are what create kindness. That night, as the wind blew across the fields, Evelyn lit an oil lamp and sat down to write a letter to the prosecutor's office in Helena Justice. Lies not only in the sentence, but also in how we live afterward, honestly, kindly, and not turning our backs on those weaker than us. She signed her name, Evelyn Hartwell Mercer, for the first time not feeling encumbered by the last name. The next morning, the town of Silver Creek greeted the new day with the smell of coffee and the sound of blacksmithing. Evelyn walked down the street, past the bakery, past the train station where gleaming cars were preparing to depart. People greeted her with familiar smiles, no more questioning looks for the postal bride. She stopped at the courthouse steps where 3 months ago she had stood as a witness to a dark time. Now there was laughter and the calls of young workers sweeping the yard. Evelyn bent down slightly and placed a sprig of daisies on the stone steps for Clara Monroe, and for her own memory. When she raised her head, the sun was already high in the sky. The highland wind blew through her hair, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and newly bloomed flowers. In that moment, Evelyn closed her eyes, fully enjoying the breath of freedom. No more fear, no more darkness, just the woman standing in the land that had once caused her pain, but now she controlled it. The narrator's voice fell silent like a farewell in that frontier land where the wind never stops and the earth waits for the hand of man. Evelyn Hartwell found what many seek all their lives: not love, not honor, but peace of mind. And sometimes that is true justice. In the story, mail-order bride thought she was marrying a poor farmer, but he owned half the territory. What remains after loss lies, and sin is not fame or romantic love, but the power of honesty and kindness. Evelyn Hartwell, a woman who left her homeland only to find a peaceful home in the end, finds something more precious: faith in justice and the human capacity for regeneration. In a harsh land where good and evil collide, she chose to stand on the side of light, not by making grand vows, but by small acts speaking the truth, standing up for what is right, and starting over with nothing. This story reminds us that justice is not only in the courtroom, but in how we live each day with kindness, and that, even if life buries us in the ashes of hurt, as long as we dare to love and believe in goodness, we can still bloom again, like the fields of Raven Hill reviving after winter. Thank you, those who listened, sympathized, and walked this emotional journey with us. If the story made you think, if you believe that kindness is still the most beautiful thing in this wild land, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, so that each of the following stories will not only be a love story of the past, but also a gentle reminder for the present that where there is kindness, there is always hope.